I gave soup to a starving little girl. She returned with a mother who solved problems Callum hadn't meant to stop. He was just passing through the narrow alley when something caught his eye. A small figure, hunched against the cold, sat on the ground. At first, he thought it was a bundle of rags, but when the figure shifted, he saw a pair of large, hungry eyes staring back at him. The girl couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, and she was thin, too thin. Her skin was a pale, light green, the color of something that had been left out in the sun for too long. Her clothes, tattered and mismatched, hung loosely on her small frame, and her feet were bare, the soles dirty and cracked from walking through harsh streets. She seemed lost, scared, and completely alone. Callum's heart tightened. He had seen the worst of the galaxy during his years as a soldier. But even now, after all the battles and the bloodshed, it still bothered him to see something so small, so vulnerable, left to fend for itself. He had always been someone who tried to do right by people, no matter where they came from or what race they were. He took a step closer. "Hey, you okay?" His voice was soft, cautious, as if he was afraid to scare her. The girl didn't answer, but she did look up at him. Her large eyes glistened, full of fear and hunger, but there was something else there too, a spark of recognition, as if she had seen too much for someone her age. She didn't move or speak. She just watched him, her small body trembling from the cold or something else. Callum sighed. He was no stranger to hardship, but he had never had to face what she was going through. There were no family members nearby, no one watching over her. He knelt down beside her and pulled a small container of soup from his bag. It wasn't much, just a simple meal he had prepared for himself earlier, but it was warm. "Here," he said gently. "I'm not much for cooking, but I think you could use this more than I can." The girl eyed the soup warily. Her eyes flicked back up to his face, as if to confirm he wasn't going to hurt her. After a long pause, she hesitantly took the bowl from his hands, her fingers trembling slightly as she grasped the warm container. Slowly, she brought it to her lips, and with a desperate look in her eyes, she took a sip. The warmth of the soup spread through her body, and for a moment the hunger in her expression seemed to ease. Callum stayed silent, watching her. He had grown up on Earth, a planet where people knew how to share and help one another. It was a basic thing, kindness, but it wasn't always common in the galaxy. Too many people were focused on power, control, and survival, and that made it all too easy to forget the simple, human acts of care that really made a difference. As she drank, Callum took in the surroundings. The alleyway was narrow, filled with old, broken crates and discarded items. The walls around them were made of steel and concrete, covered in rust and grime. This was a forgotten part of the station, a place where the wealthy traders didn't venture, and where the destitute were left to fend for themselves. Callum had seen it all before, but seeing it through the eyes of this girl made him realize just how much was wrong with the universe. When she finished the soup, the girl looked up at him again. This time, her eyes held something else, gratefulness. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke, but it was enough. "Thank you," Callum smiled softly. "No need to thank me, just take care of yourself, all right?" He didn't want to make a big deal out of it. A small kindness, that was all it was. But the girl nodded, standing up slowly. She held the empty bowl close to her chest, and then, without a word, she turned and began to walk away. "Wait!" Callum called after her. She paused, glancing back at him over her shoulder, but she didn't say anything. For a moment he thought she might vanish into the shadows, but then she stopped and gave him one last look. She seemed to be considering something, and for a second, Callum almost expected her to ask for more. But instead, she just whispered, "I'll come back." And then she was gone, disappearing into the maze of streets. Callum stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. It wasn't every day that someone like her appeared in his life, and it wasn't every day that he made a connection with someone so young, so lost. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. It was just a fleeting encounter. There were thousands of people in this station, and he was just one man. Still, as he resumed his walk down the street, he couldn't shake the feeling that this little girl was somehow important. That something about her would change the course of his life in ways he couldn't yet understand. Hours passed, and the sun set, casting the station in a cold, metallic glow. Callum returned to his small quarters, an unremarkable room with simple furniture and a few personal belongings. He ate a light dinner and tried to settle into his routine. But no matter how hard he tried to focus on the task at hand, he couldn't get the girl out of his mind. What happened to her? Where did she come from? Why was she alone? And why had she come to him? These questions buzzed in his mind like an annoying insect, and he found himself staring at the door, half expecting the girl to come knocking. But she didn't. The night passed quietly, and soon Callum's eyelids grew heavy. He couldn't help but fall asleep, but even as he closed his eyes, he felt that something was on the horizon, something big, something beyond the kindness of a simple soup and a quiet promise. It would be days before Callum would see the girl again, but when he did, it wouldn't be just her this time. And when they met, his life would be changed forever. It had been 3 days since Callum had met the little girl. He hadn't seen her again, though he'd occasionally glanced into the alley where he had found her, hoping she would come back. Life had returned to its usual routine on the station, traders making deals, the constant hum of activity, and the never-ending rush of travelers coming and going. But something about the girl stayed with him, a feeling he couldn't shake. He kept wondering if she was okay, if she had found somewhere safe, or if she had fallen deeper into the hardships of the streets. Callum didn't often get involved in the lives of others anymore. He had learned the hard way that the galaxy was too vast, too dangerous for a man like him to get caught up in other people's struggles. But the girl, there was something different about her, something that called to him even when he tried to ignore it. One afternoon, as Callum was making his usual rounds through the market district, he noticed something strange. He had just finished speaking to a merchant when he spotted her again, but this time, she wasn't alone. The girl was walking beside a tall figure, a woman whose presence seemed to command the space around her. The woman was dressed in dark, well-fitted armor, though it didn't look like the kind of military gear he had seen during his time as a soldier. The armor had an elegance to it, made from materials that shone faintly in the light, as if the suit itself held some kind of ancient power. The woman's face was strong and confident, framed by long, dark hair that fell in waves down her back. Her eyes were sharp, piercing, and cold, though they softened when she looked at the girl beside her. The little girl, Lyra, still looked fragile, but now there was a hint of something different in her expression. She seemed less afraid, though still very much out of place in this bustling, noisy part of the station. Her eyes searched the crowds with the cautiousness of someone who had learned to be wary of the world, but she stayed close to the woman, almost like a shield. She looked up at the woman every now and then, her eyes filled with trust. Callum's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the girl. He started to move toward her, but the woman stopped him with a gaze that seemed to freeze him in place. "You," the woman said, her voice low but filled with authority. She didn't raise her voice, but the power in it was undeniable. "You helped my daughter." Callum blinked, taken aback. He wasn't sure what to say at first. He had expected the girl to come back alone, perhaps to thank him, but this woman, she was no ordinary traveler. There was something about her, something that felt ancient, like she carried the weight of an entire world on her shoulders. I gave her some soup," Callum replied, his voice a bit unsure, but he tried to stand tall, not wanting to show any weakness. "She was hungry." The woman nodded, though it was hard to tell if she was pleased or simply acknowledging the fact. "You are kind. Not many in this galaxy would do the same." She paused, her gaze never leaving Callum's face. "My name is Rayla, and this is Lyra, my daughter." Callum swallowed, still processing the sudden turn of events. "Rayla," he repeated, the name echoing in his mind. It sounded familiar, though he couldn't place it. "And Lyra, it's good to see you both again." Lyra didn't say anything. She looked at him with the same wide eyes, but now there was something more, curiosity. She seemed to recognize him, though her face didn't give away any emotion. Rayla didn't wait for any more pleasantries. "You may have helped her, but you must understand this is not a simple matter. Lyra is not just any child. She is special. And there are people in the galaxy who would do anything to take her from me." Callum frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean? She's just a little girl." Rayla's expression hardened, her eyes flashing with something dangerous. "She is not just a little girl. Lyra is the last of her kind. Her people were powerful, and they were hunted down to near extinction by those who fear them." She glanced at Lyra, who now stood with her arms crossed over her chest, her head held high. "Lyra's abilities are a threat to many, and her survival depends on more than just kindness." Callum felt a chill run down his spine. He had known the galaxy could be cruel, but this was something else entirely. He didn't know how to respond. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what Rayla was saying. Lyra was special, different in some way that he couldn't understand. But why come to him? Why was she here on this station, where no one would expect a child with such power to be? Rayla seemed to sense his confusion and explained further. My daughter's people were a warrior race, skilled in combat, and they possessed abilities that even the most advanced civilizations feared. They could control energy, bend it to their will, and harness powers that no one else could even imagine. But those abilities came at a cost. The galaxy's rulers saw them as a threat and they wiped them out. Callum's mind raced. The idea of a powerful, ancient race being hunted down by the galaxy's elite was not something he could easily wrap his head around. He had heard rumors of such things, whispers of races that held incredible power but were erased from existence before they could become a real threat to the galaxy's balance. He looked down at Lyra, still trying to make sense of it all. She wasn't just some scared, starving child. She was the last of a powerful, ancient race, and those who would hunt her down would stop at nothing to do so. Rayla's voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in it. We need your help, Callum blinked. My help? He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He was just a simple merchant. What could he possibly do to help them? Rayla nodded. We need to leave this place. Lyra's abilities are becoming stronger and soon the galaxy will come for her. If we stay here, we will be discovered. I need someone who knows the station, someone who can help us navigate the danger and get out before it's too late. Callum didn't know what to say. He had never expected anything like this. He wasn't a fighter, nor was he the type to get involved in galactic politics. But looking at Lyra, seeing the trust in her eyes, he knew he couldn't just walk away. He had already helped them once. How could he turn his back now? All right, he said slowly. I'll help you. But what do you need me to do? Rayla's eyes softened slightly, though the weight of her mission remained. We need to get off the station to a place where Lyra can be trained, where she can learn to control her powers. The path will be dangerous, and we will face many obstacles, but if we don't act now, it will be too late. Callum nodded, his mind spinning with all the things he had just learned. He had no idea what he was getting into, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just about a girl who needed food anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that could change the entire galaxy. With a deep breath, Callum turned to Lyra, who was now watching him closely. He smiled at her, trying to offer some comfort. She didn't smile back, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. A spark of hope, perhaps, that she hadn't had before. Let's get you both out of here, Callum said, feeling a determination settle over him. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. As they began to walk away, Callum couldn't help but wonder how his life had come to this. One simple act of kindness had set off a chain of events that could change everything. But one thing was clear. Whatever came next, he wasn't backing down. The following days were a blur of motion. Callum and Rayla kept to the shadows, slipping through the crowded station with barely a glance from anyone who would notice them. The hustle and bustle of traders, travelers, and workers filled the station's halls, but the three of them had become increasingly aware of the danger surrounding them. Lyra's powers were not something they could keep hidden forever, and every day her abilities seemed to grow stronger, more uncontrollable. Callum had no idea what he was getting into. He had thought his days of danger were behind him when he'd left the military. But now, as he moved with Rayla and Lyra through the station's dark underbelly, it was clear that whatever was coming next would be unlike anything he had faced before. They were on their way to an old, forgotten part of the station, a place where few people dared to go. Rayla had told him it was one of the few safe places left where they could make plans. They had to be careful, though. Lyra's powers had begun to manifest more frequently, and each time they became harder to control. As they passed through the narrow corridors, Lyra walked ahead of them, her small figure almost lost in the shadows. Callum had noticed that she didn't seem as scared anymore, but she still hadn't spoken much. She would occasionally look back at him, her eyes wide, but there was a quiet strength to her now, a strength that hadn't been there when he first met her. Rayla walked beside Callum, her eyes scanning the surroundings, ever watchful. She had told him about the powers Lyra possessed, but it wasn't until he saw them firsthand that he truly understood what they were dealing with. They reached the abandoned section of the station, a place where old ships and storage units had long been left to rust. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of oil and metal. The flickering lights above them cast long shadows, creating an eerie atmosphere that seemed to match the tension in the air. "This is it," Rayla said, her voice low but firm. "We'll be safe here for a while. We can regroup and figure out what comes next." Callum nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had a soldier's instincts, and they were telling him that they weren't alone. He glanced over at Rayla, who seemed to be reading his mind. "Don't worry," she said, sensing his unease. "This place is well hidden, but we can't afford to stay here long. Lyra's abilities will draw attention eventually, and when that happens, we won't be able to hide anymore." They set up in one of the old storage rooms, a small, dimly lit space with metal walls and a few crates piled in the corners. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. Rayla immediately began preparing supplies, pulling out maps and data pads, while Lyra sat quietly in the corner. Callum couldn't help but watch her as she stared at her hands, her fingers curling and uncurling as if testing their strength. It was a strange sight. This small, fragile girl who, until recently, had been nothing more than a victim of circumstance. Now there was a quiet power in her movements, a quiet tension that told him she was no longer the same. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Rayla's voice broke through his thoughts. She was sitting across from him now, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him uneasy. "You've seen her abilities, they're growing stronger." Callum nodded slowly. "I saw it back there when we were being followed by those mercenaries, the way she manipulated the energy around us. It was incredible." Rayla sighed, rubbing her eyes as if tired from the weight of it all. "It's more than just energy manipulation. Lyra's people, the Sarathians, they could control the very fabric of reality itself. Energy, matter, it all bends to them, but there's a cost. The more she uses her powers, the more it drains her and the more it draws attention." Callum frowned. "What do you mean, it draws attention?" Rayla's gaze grew darker. "There are those who will stop at nothing to capture her, to use her powers. The galaxy's most dangerous factions, the ones who survived the fall of her people, are still out there. And they'll come for her. They always do." Callum didn't know what to say. He could see the fear in Rayla's eyes, but more than that, he saw the resolve. She wasn't just trying to protect her daughter from the galaxy, she was trying to save her from something far worse. "And you?" Callum asked, more curious now. "You said you were one of the Sarathians too. What happens if Lyra can't control her abilities?" Rayla hesitated. "If she can't control them, she'll lose herself. The power will consume her. That's why we have to get her trained. She needs to learn how to control her abilities before it's too late." Callum looked over at Lyra again, still sitting quietly in the corner. She hadn't spoken a word since they arrived. The weight of everything was clearly pressing down on her too. She was just a child, and yet she had to shoulder a burden that would crush most adults. He stood up and walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. She looked up at him with those wide, vulnerable eyes, and for a moment he saw a flicker of fear in them. But it was quickly replaced by something else, something fierce. "Lyra," he said softly, "you don't have to be afraid. We'll figure this out. You don't have to carry this alone." For a moment she didn't respond. But then she slowly stood up and walked over to him. Her small hands reached out, trembling slightly as she placed them on his chest. Callum was taken aback for a second, but then he realized she wasn't afraid of him. She was searching for something, reassurance, perhaps, or a sense of safety in a world that had been nothing but cruel to her. Rayla watched the exchange from across the room, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak, but Callum could feel her gaze on him, as if she were silently watching to see how he would react. Lyra pulled her hands back slowly, but as she did, something strange happened. A soft hum filled the air, and Callum felt a faint warmth radiating from where she had touched him. He looked down, but there was nothing there. The warmth was gone, like it had never been there at all. Lyra looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and confusion. Rayla stepped forward then, her voice calm but firm. "It's starting. She's learning to harness her abilities, but she doesn't yet understand them fully. We need to train her, Callum. We need to move fast." Callum took a deep breath, his mind spinning. He had never signed up for this. He had never expected to be involved in something so dangerous, so out of his control. But seeing Lyra, seeing her confusion and the flicker of power in her eyes, made him realize that he couldn't just walk away now. There was too much at stake. He nodded, his resolve hardening. "Where do we start?" Rayla's gaze softened just a little. "First, we need to get her to a safe place, a place where she can be trained in the ancient ways of her people, but that won't be easy. The galaxy will be hunting us and we'll have to fight every step of the way." Callum knew that Rayla was right. They had no time to waste. The danger was already closing in, and soon they would have to face it head-on. But one thing was clear, they wouldn't face it alone. "Not anymore." Callum didn't know how long they had been hiding in the abandoned storage room, but the hours seemed to stretch on endlessly. Rayla kept them moving, always alert, always prepared. But even in the dark, quiet corners of the station, Callum could feel the weight of what was happening. Lyra's powers were growing, and every day they seemed harder to control. It was only a matter of time before someone came looking for them. He had no idea how to stop it. For now, though, they were safe, at least for a little while. They couldn't stay in the same place for long, not with the galaxy's most dangerous mercenaries and bounty hunters out there hunting them. Rayla had spoken of a place where they could train Lyra, a place far from the station and its prying eyes. But it wasn't just about escaping anymore. The galaxy was getting more dangerous by the hour, and Callum wasn't sure how they would make it through. Rayla had said that they needed to get Lyra's training started right away. The girl's abilities were powerful, but they were still raw. They didn't yet have the control they needed. If she was going to survive, she needed to learn how to master them. It was late in the evening when Rayla made her decision. They couldn't wait any longer. The longer they stayed here, the more likely it was that they would be found. The time to move had come. "We need to go now," Rayla said, her voice cold and direct. "There's a transport ship leaving the station tonight. We can use it to get off-world. It's our best shot." Callum looked at her, his heart racing. "Off-world? But where are we going, and how do we know we'll be safe?" Rayla's gaze was unwavering. "It doesn't matter where we go. We can't stay here. Lyra's power will draw attention, and we won't have a chance if we don't act fast. I have a contact, someone who can help us, but we need to move quickly." Callum's mind raced. It didn't feel like they had much of a plan, but then again, he couldn't think of a better one. He trusted Rayla more than he cared to admit. She had been calm and collected so far, even in the face of impossible odds. And there was something else, something about the way she carried herself, the way she protected Lyra. "What about Lyra?" Callum asked. "She's getting stronger, but she's still a kid. How are we going to keep her safe?" Rayla's expression softened just for a moment. "I know it's hard to understand, but Lyra isn't like other children. She's capable of more than you know, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure she's ready." Callum nodded. He didn't fully understand what she meant, but he trusted her. He had no choice. They spent the next hour gathering their things and making preparations. Rayla went over the details again, making sure that every move they made was calculated, that they wouldn't be seen. Callum helped as best he could, but there was still a gnawing feeling in his gut. Every time he glanced over at Lyra, he saw how exhausted she was. She hadn't spoken much since their arrival in the abandoned storage room. Her eyes seemed haunted, as if she knew what was coming. They moved quickly through the dark hallways of the station, Rayla leading the way, Callum close behind. Lyra walked silently between them, her steps almost too quiet. Callum found himself looking over his shoulder every few seconds, half expecting someone to jump out at them, but the halls were eerily empty. It felt like the calm before a storm. The transport ship was located at the far edge of the station, near the docks where the larger cargo ships came and went. The area was always busy, filled with crew members, pilots, and maintenance workers rushing to and fro. If they were careful, they could slip by unnoticed. But that was a big if. Rayla's eyes darted back and forth, scanning the crowds ahead of them. Callum did his best to keep up with her, his hand resting on the side of his weapon, just in case. The closer they got to the transport ship, the more tension filled the air. Every footstep seemed louder, every movement more dangerous. Callum could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. When they finally reached the loading dock, Callum let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But the feeling of relief didn't last long. A low hum filled the air, and suddenly the sound of engines roaring to life echoed through the station. Callum's eyes shot to the dock's entrance and his stomach dropped. "Get down!" Rayla hissed, pulling Lyra behind a row of large crates. Callum dove behind them as well, his heart pounding in his chest. From his position, he could see the transport ship taking off, its engines glowing bright against the station's dim lighting. It wasn't their ship. They had missed it. Rayla cursed under her breath. No time. "We have to move." Callum's mind raced. If they didn't get on that transport ship, they would be stranded here. They couldn't afford to wait. They had no other options. "Where now?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. Rayla looked around, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The cargo ships were too large, too obvious. But then her gaze shifted to a smaller vessel parked a little further down the dock, its lights off and its engines idle. It was a private shuttle, fast and low-key. "That's our chance," Rayla said, already moving in that direction. Callum and Lyra followed quickly, trying to stay out of sight. As they reached the shuttle, Callum felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. What if they were caught? What if the mercenaries were already on their tail? They boarded the shuttle in silence. Rayla took the pilot's seat, her fingers flying over the controls with expert precision. Callum and Lyra sat in the back, Lyra still silent, her eyes fixed on her hands as if she were lost in thought. Callum sat beside her, watching her closely. He had seen the power she was capable of, but he couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. Was she scared? Was she ready for what was to come, or was she just confused? "Lyra," he said softly, not sure if she would respond. To his surprise, she looked up at him, her eyes dark and full of something Callum couldn't place. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, shaking her head. "It's okay," he said, trying to reassure her. "We're going to be all right." Rayla's voice broke through the quiet hum of the shuttle's engines. "We won't be safe for long," she said, her tone sharp. "The galaxy won't give up looking for us. We'll need to stay ahead of them." And Lyra, she glanced back at her daughter, her expression filled with a mixture of determination and something else, something softer. "Lyra, you have to be ready." Lyra nodded slowly, but Callum could see the uncertainty in her eyes. The weight of her power was becoming more real with each passing minute. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. As the shuttle ascended and the station grew smaller in the distance, Callum knew they were leaving behind everything they had known. They were entering a new chapter in their journey, one that would take them into the unknown. But one thing was certain, they were in this together, for better or worse. And no matter what, Callum would do whatever it took to protect them. The shuttle glided through the emptiness of space, its engines humming softly as it drifted farther from the station. Callum couldn't help but glance back at the fading lights of the station. It seemed like a lifetime ago that he had been just another merchant, selling trinkets and goods to travelers. Now, everything had changed. He was running from something bigger than he could ever have imagined, and all he could do was hold on and hope that they could make it through whatever came next. Rayla kept her eyes fixed on the controls, her hands steady and sure as she guided the shuttle through the dark void. She didn't speak much, but Callum could see the determination in her posture. She was in charge here, and he knew she would do whatever it took to keep them safe. But even Rayla couldn't predict what was coming. The galaxy was full of dangers, and they were just one small ship, with one very important person aboard. Lyra sat quietly in the back of the shuttle, her eyes fixed on the window. She had barely spoken since they left the station, her small figure curled into herself as if trying to make herself smaller. Callum could see the weight of everything pressing down on her. She had already been through so much in her short life, and now, with her powers growing stronger, the world seemed like a place that only wanted to take everything from her. Callum couldn't imagine what it must feel like to carry such a burden. He was used to fighting battles, but they were always physical, something he could see and understand. But what Lyra was going through was different. Her powers weren't something she could control, and yet they were a part of her. A part that was dangerous not just to her, but to everyone around her. He couldn't help but feel responsible for her now, even though he had no idea what he could do to help. Rayla broke the silence, her voice low but firm. "We'll be safe for a while, but we can't stay out here forever. We'll need to find a place to lay low, somewhere where Lyra can get the training she needs. I know of a few places, but we have to move fast. The longer we wait, the more likely it is that they'll catch up with us." Callum nodded, his eyes shifting to Lyra. She hadn't said a word in hours, but he could see her eyes flicker to him every now and then. He knew she was scared, but what could he say to her? Words didn't seem like enough. "We're in this together," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. He wasn't sure if Lyra heard him, but she looked up at him, her eyes tired but full of something he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was trust. Maybe it was something deeper, something that only the two of them shared now. The journey through space felt endless. The stars stretched out in every direction, and the vastness of the galaxy seemed to swallow them whole. Time lost its meaning, and for a moment, Callum forgot about everything, about the chase, about the danger. He focused only on the present moment, on the quiet hum of the shuttle and the steady rhythm of Lyra's breathing beside him. But eventually, the calm was broken. Rayla's voice was sharp, filled with urgency. "We're coming up on the outskirts of the system, get ready." Callum's heart rate quickened. They were approaching their destination, Rayla's safe house. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it had to be secure. Rayla wouldn't have brought them here if she didn't trust it. Still, the closer they got, the more tension built inside him. He could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on them. As they entered the atmosphere of a nearby planet, Callum could see the surface below. It was a desolate world, with barren mountains and vast deserts stretching as far as the eye could see. There were no cities, no signs of civilization, only a few scattered outposts. It didn't look like a place anyone would want to live, but that was probably the point. The less attention they drew, the better. Rayla set the shuttle down in a small, hidden valley surrounded by jagged cliffs. It was the perfect place to hide, isolated and difficult to reach. As the engines powered down, the silence of the planet seemed to swallow them whole. Callum exhaled slowly, his nerves still on edge. "Is this it? This is where we're going to stay?" Rayla didn't answer immediately. She unbuckled her seatbelt and turned to face him, her eyes steady but dark with something he couldn't quite read. "It's temporary," she said. "Lyra needs to train, and I need to make sure we're not followed. We can't afford to stay in one place for too long." Callum looked over at Lyra, who was now staring out the window. Her face was pale, and she looked exhausted, but there was something different in her eyes. Something that wasn't there before. Maybe it was a kind of quiet determination. She wasn't just a frightened girl anymore. She was beginning to understand the power she held. The shuttle doors opened, and Callum stepped out onto the rocky ground. The air was dry and cold, but it felt refreshing after the long journey through space. He looked around at their surroundings, taking in the stark, barren landscape. There was no sign of life anywhere. The only sound was the wind howling across the valley. Rayla led them to a small, hidden cave that she had used as a base of operations during her time as a warrior. It was a safe place, far away from prying eyes, and there was a simple setup inside. A few old crates filled with supplies, a small fire pit, and a bedroll in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Lyra immediately moved to the back of the cave, her eyes still distant. She hadn't spoken since they landed, and Callum could see the weight of the journey settling on her. He wanted to go to her to say something, but he wasn't sure what. What could he say to a child who was carrying the fate of an entire people on her shoulders? Rayla knelt down beside Lyra, her voice soft but firm. "It's time. You need to start learning how to control your abilities. We don't have much time." Lyra didn't look up, but she nodded. Her hands were still trembling slightly, but there was a quiet strength in her that hadn't been there before. She was ready, even if she didn't fully understand what that meant. Rayla stood up, turning to Callum. "Stay with her. Make sure she doesn't push herself too hard." "We're going to need her at her best." Callum nodded, his chest tight with a feeling he couldn't place. He wasn't sure how much help he could be, but he was here now. He wasn't going anywhere. As Rayla began to gather supplies for Lyra's training, Callum sat down beside her, trying to think of something to say. He wasn't sure what would help, what could possibly help, but he had to try. "Lyra," he said softly, "we'll get through this together." She didn't respond at first, but then, after a long silence, she looked up at him. Her eyes were full of uncertainty, but there was something else there too, a flicker of trust, maybe even hope. And for the first time in a long while, Callum felt like they had a chance. It wasn't much, but it was enough.